Looks like it's live.
It is. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our latest version of our Mental Health Mondays on the last Monday of every month. Today's topic is going to be diving into boundaries. We've been in the middle of publishing a three-part series on our website blog. The first two are now up. The third will follow in the next couple of days. So we'll be diving into at least the first couple of parts of this in this conversation. And we'll see if we end up covering everything, or maybe we'll go more into them in our next session. So I'm Jen Kohler. I'm the co-founder and president of Atlas Assistance Dogs. And I'll let Michelle and Sarah introduce themselves and take this away.
Great. Hi, my name is Michelle DeRosa. I'm a licensed counselor, and I wrote the blog post about boundaries that's on the website, and I'm excited to share a little bit more about boundaries today and what it means to service dog handlers.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Pellizzari. I'm a licensed clinical social worker based in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and just here to join our talk about boundaries. I'm a member of the Atlas Mental Health Committee as well. So happy to be here and talk on this subject that is near and dear to my heart.
All right. Well, I can get started of just kind of talking about why boundaries. When we were kind of picking what blog topics to post and what's important for service dog handlers and service dogs, and really just anyone in general, we started talking about how important boundaries are. And when we say the word boundaries, probably a lot of things come to mind for a lot of people. I know for myself, boundaries were kind of almost frustrating of a concept because for many people, we set lots of boundaries, or we think we are setting what we think are boundaries, and then they don't work, or people cross them, or we're having to just amend them constantly. And so this first part of the blog and what we're kind of going to be focusing on today is what boundaries are, like what constitutes a boundary, maybe some different types of boundaries, and how we can be inspired in our lives to notice spaces. Like, what does it mean to notice you might need a boundary? What's happening in your body, in your attitudes, in your relationships that kind of give that, okay, I might need a boundary here. I borrowed a lot from a really great social worker, licensed social worker, Nedra Glover Tawwab. She wrote Set Boundaries, Find Peace. That book was amazing. It's linked in that blog post as you can Audible it, you can read it, I believe, on all the Kindles. And that was a really great intro into what boundaries are. So I kind of shared a little bit about what boundaries felt like to me starting out. Again, frustrating, not really sure what they were, but to put it simply, boundaries, are behaviors or guidelines or a set of, I don't want to use the word rules, but a set of like standards that are based on your values, or they're informed by your values, and values meaning things you find important, things that inform or are informed by your worldviews or your beliefs. And boundaries are things that we set in place in order to keep ourselves safe. So for like my clients, I like to think of like 100 acres that are fenced in. Those are your boundaries, as the fences, and you can adjust what those boundaries look like, how tall, how short, who you bring into your 100 acres, what your 100 acres looks like. And as we go farther in today's discussion, we'll get more specific with analogies and specific about what boundaries are. But I'm interested in hearing from Sarah or Jen, what boundaries, like when you all, like what boundaries mean to you, or when you all kind of thought, man, I should really look into this boundaries stuff and maybe practice it in my own life.
Yeah, I really like the definition that you provided. Boundaries can be based on our values. And I think with that being said, we don't all have the same values. And I think what becomes a little bit tricky for us to weed out with boundaries is sometimes we don't really know, like, when we need to set them until after the fact, right? Until we start, like you indicated, Michelle, like signs in our bodies or something telling us, like, it's just not, we're not in a good place, right? And maybe a boundary has been tested or violated, and maybe not intentionally, but because we hadn't really set it and like set a precedent for a boundary, that's just the way that it flowed and happened. So my personal experience is a lot of trial and error, and especially, boundaries, I think we could talk about them on all planes of our life, right? So it can be our personal life, it can be our work life, it can be, our spiritual life, like whatever your communities look like, you can set boundaries within those. But I think for each individual to define them can almost be like the hardest part of that. And then, setting them really consistently is another piece that I think we oftentimes stumble through, especially if maybe we haven't always felt like strong in our capabilities with communicating and being assertive. And maybe, some of us, and especially, I guess, the animal care or like welfare field, or, dog trainers, it's really easy for us to sort of bend our boundaries because we have a lot of compassion for others. And sometimes we get that mixed up with, our self-compassion a little bit, and have a conflict of interest, with those value systems. So we may have different values that start to conflict with one another. So yeah, I think that boundaries, they look different for each person, but that the responsibility ends up falling on us to know, and looking within that 100 acres, and knowing like what are the boundaries around that for each person. So yeah, so I don't know if Jen wants to add anything to that, but
I definitely resonated with what you said about often discovering after the fact that it's like, oh, I should have set a boundary here. And especially being in this position where we're trying to help people, we're trying to help animals, you don't want to say no. And I know we as women, especially in these fields, tend to say yes far more than we should. And I think that's one of the things that I'm having to learn, and continue to have to learn, is that sometimes it's better to say no than to say yes and actually not be able to succeed, right? That you're actually not helping people if you try to deliver something that you just don't have the capacity to do. That, having some of those boundaries, as you noted, for your own capacity and own self really can make a difference. And I think I've really learned with this that actually it can really help the people that I'm working with for me to have consistent boundaries, because then they know what to expect. Then they're not anxious and wondering, well, when will I respond? What does it mean that it's taken me a day to get back to them? Right? That they aren't sitting and kind of spiraling in their own interpretation of that, because they know a boundary I have set is, if you contact me in this certain way, that means I know it's not an emergency and I can get back to you in X amount of time, versus if you call me. So I've actually learned that really helps remove stress from other people too, by knowing what to expect.
Yeah, I agree with that. Those are really good examples, Jen and Sarah, of like, we often find out boundaries need to be placed when we feel that. And we wrote this, or we were talking about this for service dog handlers or service dog and training handlers, because throughout our day-to-day, there are so many areas that someone who is handling a service dog or a service dog trainer runs into that often needs to have boundaries. So as I mentioned in our last Facebook Live, briefly, I was a service dog handler for 10 years, about 10 years, with my first service dog. And oh my gosh, I learned so much about just going into public spaces, being not really set up for maybe my own personal success. So like Jennifer just said, we want to say yes to education opportunities. We want to say yes to a lot of things. Yes to ourselves. Yes to our own goals. If you're a service dog in training and if you're a service dog facilitator or trainer, you have all these like goals and things you want to see from your client and even for yourself. And so often the first like notice that there's something that a boundary could happen is, yeah, stepping away from that, recognizing that maybe your values or your dignity or your personal space or something like that just didn't feel respected or safe. So in the blog, I kind of start with some examples, some common examples that probably many of us have encountered. So I'll share a couple of those. So like if you're taking your service dog with you to the pharmacy, and you are standing in line and someone comes up to you and you need to be in and out of this pharmacy really quick. And someone comes up and says, oh my gosh, what a beautiful dog. Why do you have a service dog? Can I ask what that service dog is for? And you just can't say no. You feel like you just can't say no to someone asking more and more kind of questioning, invasive questions. And there's a part of you that wants to educate, but there's a large part of you that's like, I just need to get this medicine. I feel awful. I need to go to my next appointment. And then maybe if you didn't have a boundary set with others, you stay longer than you need to. Now you're late to your next appointment. You're feeling awful. You're feeling drained. Maybe your service dog has alerted you multiple times that, hey, there are some things you need to take care of your body. But because we're wrapped up in this perception, we need to, we feel like we have to be there. We can't say no. You leave that experience feeling drained, burnt out maybe over time if this isn't the first time or the first 100th time that this has happened. Some other examples could be for service dog trainers. I'd love for Sarah or Jen to pop in with some examples of like where a boundary could be before we get to kind of talking about what types of boundaries there are. Let's lay out with some examples of what boundaries are or what boundaries could be in different environments.
And I think
absolutely. I mean, you
go
just
for it,
gave
Sarah.
such a beautiful example there with the farm. And it's sometimes it's the ones that catch us off guard, right? Where we're out and about and we're already stressed and we're tired and, we know we're stressed and, we're just trying to get through and we know we need to set a boundary. And sometimes in those moments, it can be hard to even access that part of our brain that says, hey, like you just need to set a boundary when you're feeling very stressed. So I like that example because we have a lot of those unexpected, times come up. It's not necessarily like a relationship that you continuously have with someone where you're setting boundaries. There are some things, especially in service dog training, that tend to be those one-offs, right? That maybe you won't experience in other parts of your life or, might not have the same challenges. But I definitely think, boundaries around the questions from the public is a big one that I hear oftentimes. And also, just knowing like for your own personal space, like how much time you want to spend like in a certain environment and in and out, just having that sense of like time and space. And sometimes when we're going through the day to day, that awareness, I think, can sort of like go to the wayside, right? We know we're stressed and we know like we have cumulative stress that's adding up, but sometimes it's not clicking as like, hey, I'm stressed. I just need to make it in and out and like a quick, time to do this. And, sometimes I think it's okay too to say, well, if I'm feeling really stressed and I don't necessarily need my dog like to do this job for me right now, would it be easier for me to maybe not bring the dog to the pharmacy this time? And I think that can be an interesting boundary that service dog handlers, the owners have to sort of confront with themselves sometimes. It's like, well, you're used to having your dog, that partnership with you, but maybe sometimes it might be better to not, like for your own sake, right? So I do think that that's a boundary too. I don't know if Jen has anything to add when you're thinking about, trainers and boundaries. Those are kind of the ones that come to mind for me is like, where do you draw the boundary for yourself, right? Because you're going to inevitably get questions and, people and things like that every day.
I think one thing that I was thinking of to add on to what you said about that is also to recognize that those boundaries might change depending on our energy level, right? You're talking about, hey, here's a case where you're not feeling well, you're running in to try to get medication. I know for me, an area my boundaries really change around access to my dog is when I'm traveling. That I may be much more willing to say, sure, you can say hi when, I'm somewhere a little bit more relaxed. If I'm at the airport, I don't want to deal with anything else other than the stress of what I'm already doing. And so there may be certain times where, depending on the context, I will have different boundaries. Or like, I know that my dog is phenomenal with kids. And so if I see a child that's upset, or I see a child that's like crying, or they show they're scared of dogs, I'm often willing to let him interact because I know that he really helps those people because he's so gentle and easy with kids. Where I might not let that same interaction, say, with an adult who I don't think particularly needs it. So I think that's one thing, is just that boundary can change. As a trainer, I think it's a couple of things. One, I think this is true for probably any, service provider where we're working with people or animals, it's really, I find for me, time boundaries are a tough one. So setting, okay, no, we said the session's 45 minutes, or we said the session's an hour. We're going to end when we said we are. Or this is when we agreed we'd start. And if the person is always late, or changing last minute, like actually holding firm to that, versus saying, oh, that's okay. That's okay. I feel like those are really tough ones, especially when you're working with people with disabilities, people that have a lot of health challenges that may have very legitimate reasons to be late. Or, there's very legitimate reasons your time went on a long time. They were really wanting to talk about what was going on in their life that day, and figuring out how to set those boundaries for everybody's sake. Because what you don't then realize is, oh, I just let that session drag on for 2 hours instead of 1. Well, everybody's exhausted at the end and nobody remembers what we actually covered. So that extra time we thought we were giving actually wasn't helpful.
That's a really good point. It's a really good point. And also, is it really sustainable, like for the, person who is wanting a dog trained for them to, expect like it's going to look the same way every time? We kind of talked about this a little bit on the last live call. Or can we have like an honest conversation of like, well, some days, you may show up late and we may have a shorter session, and that's okay. And can we just kind of, change the way that maybe we're looking at our expectations? Because that's not just about the session, like you alluded to, it's about their life and about, things that are, consistently rolling and happening. So normalizing that, right? It's like, it's okay if you got here late, like I understand, but we have X amount of time left. Maybe we can focus on the one thing that we feel like is most valuable in that time that's really going to help you get that nugget of success in that training session, rather than saying, okay, like, you want your client to be successful, and like having those emotions can be really hard, but actually, it's actually counterproductive. Like Jen was pointing out, like you're all exhausted at the end. They probably already had maybe somewhat of a stressful or hard day if they're showing up late, right? One would guess. So kind of pointing those out, really having honest conversations. The best thing that I've learned about boundaries is being honest with yourself and being honest with other people. Will take you much further than saying, oh, it's okay, but then feeling that resentment inside or feeling exhausted later. The honesty will set everybody up much better. And that most of the time, that consistency, like Michelle was talking about, people know what to expect. We'll actually see things start to get better over time. So
yeah, what you guys are just talking about, the consequences of not having boundaries. Ironically, it's, boundaries we'll talk about in a second. The formula for boundaries is to have a consequence to if your boundary is crossed, but let's talk about the consequences first of like when we don't have boundaries. So you both talked about like if you don't have time boundaries for your training, your facilitating or your training, then that can lead to feeling resentment, burnout. Nedra Glover Tawwab, who wrote the book that I referenced a lot in the blog, because I didn't make all these things up. It says burnout is overwhelming and boundaries are the cure. And when I read that, it just kind of really struck me because burnout, resentment, Sarah, in our field as clinicians, we probably, when we go through graduate school and supervision and our licensure, we get told a lot, like having boundaries is not just helpful for the clients, like who we're serving, but also for ourselves, making sure that we have, like if you're a service dog facilitator or trainer and you are burnt out, then you are not going to be able to help your clients get their disabilities mitigated through their service dog. It just kind of is this the analogy I like to think about is when you're on a plane and they tell you to put the oxygen mask on yourself before putting it on someone else. So it's not because we're all selfish and we just all want the oxygen, but because if someone who is less able to place oxygen on themselves, like a child or somebody who has disabilities that can't maneuver in these spaces, then if you are focused on putting it on everybody else, then at some point you're going to pass out. You're going to be burnt out, for our analogy, and you're not going to be able to help other people. So creating boundaries is not just, and holding to boundaries is not just a good suggestion. It often is really necessary when we're balancing, or if we're in multiple roles, which most of us listening and here have multiple roles. We're not just a service dog handler or just a facilitator, not just a mental health clinician. We have relationship roles. We're friends, we're family members, we're partners, all of these things. So I want to shift to naming the types of boundaries. And what I mean by types of boundaries is most people fall under these categories. And we've talked about examples of like where we wish we would have had boundaries, or maybe our boundaries were really weak. On the blog post, we talked about three different kinds or types of boundaries. And so I want us to kind of imagine a spectrum of boundaries. So on one end, you have what is called porous boundaries. And so we think of porous, think of like a sponge, something that has holes in it. So these boundaries are often they've got the holes in them. They're maybe vague. You might find it's hard to say no. Sometimes it's yes, sometimes it's no. And that's different than what Jim was talking about, boundaries changing. Like if we're intentionally changing a boundary, then that's different than, okay, oh, I'll say yes this time, but really inside, I'm feeling upset, resentful, not seen, not heard. We're kind of wanting someone else to make the boundary for us. So having porous boundaries can lead to a lot of overexertion, a lot of anxiety, a lot of unhealthy relationships, because there's not a lot of like stability or consistency, as you all were saying. Then on the far end, so we have porous, where kind of everything goes, or maybe we don't have consistent boundaries. On the other end, we have rigid boundaries, which sounds great, but rigid boundaries can be very strict. They can be inflexible. So sometimes I find that rigid boundaries can be just as harmful as someone who has no boundaries or very porous boundaries. So an example of that might be if Jenny, you gave the example of like allowing, seeing a kid who's crying and you're like, oh, my dog's really good with kids. If you had rigid boundaries and you said, I don't let my dogs go to anyone ever, period, then you kind of are shutting people out. You're shutting that part that could be very enriching for you and your dog and the other person out, or kind of disregarding maybe other people's needs if our boundaries are always no or rigid or unchanging. So I sometimes find, and Sarah and Jen, you can pop in too, is in my work with like people who maybe have had no boundaries or porous boundaries over time, when they find their voice, they often jump right to rigid boundaries. As like, I've never had a voice, and so now everything is no, or everything has to be this way. And that's very normal to kind of bounce back and forth and figuring out your voice and how to be listened to. But really, we're trying to look into the middle, which is what we would call healthy boundaries, which is built on this self-awareness. It's not built on like emotional baggage or trauma history or things like that, where we kind of knee-jerk our reactions to things. And this is where we're direct, we're clear with what we need, and we also have flexibility there.
Mhm. I think definitely flexibility is a good word to think of when we're trying to figure out, well, where is that middle ground, right? Um, and it can be tricky, and like you're saying, Michelle, like you can definitely vacillate between like having, very loose boundaries and having very rigid boundaries when you're trying to figure it out. Um, Sometimes it does go back to, considering one's own values, right? And really reflecting on, well, where do I need to set the boundaries more? Like, what is going to help me, be able to have the downtime that I need, or to be able to do like, have your service dog have some downtime, like we're kind of indicating too, and like having more of an enriching life for them. Um, I think these are kind of gray areas that sometimes it takes a little while to figure out. I think that sometimes, our own personalities can definitely play into boundaries too. So if you tend to have like a more of a anxious personality or, a perfectionistic personality, I think it can be hard to figure out that middle ground and say, okay, well, I don't have to be too rigid, but I also don't have to like, bend over backward and say yes to everybody. And so, the more practice I think that you get at it, the more it starts to feel like, okay, this is starting to make sense. Like it's reinforcing to me to set boundaries, and maybe the negative reaction that a lot of people are scared of as like a repercussion for setting boundaries isn't actually going to happen. I think sometimes we realize that too, is most of the time people appreciate the boundary setting as long as we're, clear and like we do it in like a kind way, and um in a way that, is in that middle ground, if that makes sense. So maybe we could think of another example of like a situation where we have to set boundaries that could be um a little bit tricky, and like how you find
Mhm.
that middle ground.
Yeah. Yeah. I like how you said that it takes practice. The blog post 3 does talk about and give some specific examples that examples of practice. It gives some examples of scenarios and then what you could say. So I like that maybe we can include that in here, and it segues into like what kinds of boundaries can you create? Like, can they be physical, emotional, time-based? Can they be relational? So yeah, let's think of like a good boundary. Um, I've got an example. So my service dog in training, Light. I've had to set myself time-based boundaries. When he was younger, I feel like I was spending every waking moment doing something to enrich this puppy, or I was feeling guilt, shame, worry, fear that he's not going to meet his milestones, all of these things. And at some point, um, I had to really set a time-based boundary and say, okay, like I need time to not be so involved in this. It's causing feelings of resentment, stress, all of that. So putting a limit on the weekly or daily activities, or even putting things on the back burner and saying, all right, I'm giving ourselves 3 weeks off, 4 weeks, or this month, or whatever it is, to just let things settle and build our relationship. That's a boundary.
Absolutely. That's a really good example. I also think of, when we go back to our values again, because I really do think that can be a little bit of our map,
Hmm.
if there are things that we really enjoy doing, why shouldn't that be as much of a priority as dog training or
Yeah.
as our job? I think that
Hmm.
sometimes we get these ideas in our head that like, okay, work's the most important thing, or, training is the most important thing. When in reality, that's not true. And if we really take
Yeah.
a look at, what our needs are as humans, like we need balance, right? Like we need
Hmm.
balance, and to have all of those things like paid attention to. So sometimes just defining for yourself, well, am I spending enough time like, relaxing, doing fun things? Like what else comes into my life that, maybe needs a little more attention right now? And I think when you start to prioritize those things a little bit more, give them kind of equal value, then you'll find that like saying no to certain things starts to come a little bit more naturally, because you're like, well,
Yeah.
that's not what I'm devoting this time to, right?
Hmm.
So sometimes it does come down to a little bit of that, time and energy management again, and really knowing for yourself, well, each person is different, but what, makes you feel in balance? Like, what do you need to have a little bit more of sometimes? And how do you know that for yourself?
And I
Yeah.
think the grays can be really hard, and especially we're working with a lot of people that may not be neurotypical or maybe neurodivergent or maybe the autism spectrum, where grays are very hard.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think that also can get challenging of how do you help both figure out what someone else's boundaries are or even help them set them when you're working with them. And I think sometimes part of setting your own can also be part of like having that conversation to help set expectations and help somebody else set their own boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially with like coaching our clients, there's a lot of work in there of helping them learn how to self-advocate
Yeah.
and learning when do you say no, when do you say yes, when do you decide you want to be in a educator role, when is it okay just to say, you know what, I just here, read my ID card, I just want to sit down.
Yeah.
Giving yourself the kind of different permissions, and kind of boundaries of how much energy are you going to expend in a given
Mhm.
day. And I think that that grayness without kind of feeling the guilt or, oh, I should be doing this each time is really hard for a lot of people.
It is. It is. And it goes into some cultural considerations too. You gave in like neurodivergent considerations and disability considerations, but something that I wanted to point out in that post and what is so important is boundaries are influenced by a lot of factors. Culture, Sarah talked about personal values. Sometimes making a behavioral change, which that's what a boundary is, you are making a change to your behavior that regardless of what that other person does to your boundary. Like, so if you say a boundary, like, I'm not going to answer that question, or here's my card. We can't control what they do, right? We're making the behavior change. I often like to say boundaries are not for other people, they are for you. Um, but when we make those changes, people can respond positively, negatively. Family members can respond positively, negatively. The things that our cultures and our backgrounds can come up a lot. So when we make changes, there can be positive feelings like relief or gratitude, confidence, but there can also be feelings of shame and different connotations that come from different cultures. So I think about there's some individualistic cultures. So a lot of the US and Canada and Northern Europe, there's, we're more individualistic. So boundaries might be praised or more of a common thing to even talk about. Where if you have collectivist cultures, East Asia, Latin America, areas that are more collectivist, boundaries are often not really celebrated, or the needs of the group or family take precedence over individual needs. So boundaries can be very challenging or difficult to navigate personally, like your personal values. So I think it's really important to consider your values, your culture, and establishing boundaries that uh, work best for your life, and they can change. Um, I like to also point out that boundaries help create interdependence rather than dependence. So in some backgrounds or family culture or just general culture, that needs of many can really come in with shame or guilt or betrayal. Like, well, if I put this boundary with my family, I've asked my family to, we talk about service dog etiquette and things. I've asked my family to stop doing XYZ behavior.
Hmm.
But if I keep saying no, I'm disrespecting my elders, I'm disrespecting, then or if we create interdependence, relationships become beneficial in the long term versus that dependency or the unhealthy dynamics there. So I wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting how, when you do think about family and, culture coming into play, how sometimes one of the big challenges that I hear about, and not just service dog training and dog training in general, is having everybody in the family on the same page with expectations and respecting boundaries, especially around, what you're trying to teach your dog, the ways that you're trying to teach your dog. Things like that. I think that comes up a lot. And so knowing how to have those conversations with family, that definitely can be a little bit difficult. And sometimes I think, like, as a client, it's valuable to talk to your trainer about that and maybe put your heads together and figure out, well, what are some ways that we can bring this up that will, maybe help your family to feel involved, but also like if they're at that point where they can feel involved and they're not doing something that is just, completely out of bounds, because we hear that too. How can they be involved, but, not overwhelming to you? I think that comes up too. So really kind of having those conversations around, like, what do you want it to look like in your household, with respect to how, each family member and your neighbors and your friends are interacting with your service dog too. So that's a whole other, I feel like, world of boundaries that comes up.
I like your statement about having people feel involved, because that is often one of the things I find very helpful that works for a lot of people
Hmm.
is, saying to your, family member or child or, so I was like, look, I'm really trying to do this. Like, I really need this for my health, and I'm only going to do this with your help. So I really need your help to make sure my dog is successful at, leaving food. So I really need to make sure that you're not offering them this food, or I'm not going to be able to complete this. Can you help me do this? But kind of putting it in those terms of saying, can you help me? Even if we're asking them to actually not do anything, right? Or stop doing it, if you turn it into that, I need your help, that often works really well.
Yeah.
That's a good point. And I think sometimes there are the ends where you can sort of say, well, instead of doing this, like, why don't let's focus on trying this instead. And you can kind of help, family members, like, they'll see the success over time too. I think everybody sometimes wants to jump in and they want it to go a certain way, or, we get very problem focused. And oftentimes, like, when we get problem focused, it's really hard to actually take a step back and find some good solutions. So, either, yeah, like saying, yes, in order for you to be on board and help me, maybe just let me do this part and just be there as a support. Or if there's something concrete that they could change that you're like, oh, they want to be involved, but instead of, encouraging this behavior in the dog, like, let's show them how to try this instead. So, and I know that's a really general example, but I think that as trainers and, clients are working together, they will see those situations come up and maybe need to talk about it a little bit and figure out together, well, for this family member, like, what do we feel like we want their level of involvement to look like? And how could that play out? Like, are they a part of the training plan too? Or do we just need them to kind of fade in the background a little bit and give us some space for a while?
Yeah. Those are all really good points. And something that I hear a lot is, well, I've done all these things. I've placed a boundary. I've told them no, and it doesn't work. Does anyone, Sarah, do you hear that? And Jen, yeah, like it doesn't work.
Yeah. Or you have
Um,
personal experience too, and
yeah, yeah, we all have personal, yeah, I'm sure of just,
I won't
and it,
lie, yeah.
yeah, it kind of goes back to, I know I talked a lot about collectivist culture, but
Mhm,
individualistic cultures, if everyone's like, yeah, boundaries are great, celebrated, sometimes people can be so individualistic. It's like,
mhm,
well, I'm entitled to, like, yeah, you set a boundary, but I want to do this behavior still.
mhm,
You've asked this person, hey, can we figure out together how to take care, like you guys' example about maybe when to feed the dog, or how to behave with a family, with your service dog. But what happens when somebody doesn't listen to the boundaries? So boundaries aren't just a great way of saying no or giving them parameters, but it's also, again, I go back to, boundaries are for ourselves. We can't ever make anyone do anything. And if our boundaries are hinged upon somebody else's behavior of working, then we're going to get really frustrated really quickly. Boundaries are about, and need to be set up with a if then. Like, if this, we're asking for support, help, a behavior, and if that doesn't happen, then we need to either remove ourselves or change something. If we think back to the analogy of the 100 acres, then we need to raise the fences, or we need to disinvite that person. Or if we think of a more realistic analogy, If I'm out somewhere and say I have a friend, I think one of the analogies I put in the blog is if somebody, you're out with a friend who consistently tries to feed or interrupt or distract your dog, then after saying, hey, when we go out, I'd really appreciate if you didn't hand feed my dog while we're at this restaurant. It's really, and you maybe you wanted to explain why it was important. You don't have to explain. No is a complete sentence, or just saying this is what I don't want. And say they do that, then we could say, well, the boundary didn't work. I guess, I'm screwed. Or there is an if then. Well, I've asked for this, and you didn't do that. So I'm going to end our outing, or I'm not going to go out with you anymore to these restaurants together. And of course, there's going to be a reaction. But when we think about boundaries and if they're not working, we really need to step back and look, am I enforcing, or is there a consequence to this behavior so that I can protect myself? So if I remove myself from that situation, I'm protected, my dog is safe, my values are protected then. It doesn't always feel like in the moment really good, because you're having to make these, again, behavior changes. But over the long run, I am going to feel less frustrated, burnt out, because maybe I've been inside feeling like I don't even want to go out with this person if this is how they're going to behave towards my dog. So there's some other things that I'm thinking of too, but I want to toss this back to Sarah and Jen about what do we do if boundaries don't seem to work? How do we slow it down, look at our behavior, see is it a time for a consequence, or maybe do we need to adjust or change the boundary? Maybe it's too rigid, or maybe it's too porous.
That's a really, really great thing to think about. I think, obviously our relationships as humans can be really complicated. And sometimes, with friends or with family, especially, we can have some enmeshment where like the boundaries weren't really there to begin with. And you're throwing in the, service dog training on top of that, and it can get a little messy. Sometimes in those situations, we may not really have the ability to completely, take space from that person. Like it's not always possible, especially if you live with them, right?
Yeah, that's
So,
true.
so sometimes you can frame it as, well, I really appreciate it when you do this, and then throw in, this is something that makes me feel really overwhelmed. Like this is something that makes me feel frustrated. Um, and you can put it in a way that's like you're not saying you do this to me, but like pointing it
Mm.
out to them and saying I would prefer like when this happens and appreciate when you show up for me this way, because this is how I feel like when this happens, right? So I think I feel statements can be pretty powerful,
Yeah.
so that
Mhm.
it kind of redirects to like, okay, this is how it's affecting, how I feel, and like how I'm processing like the situation, can feel a little bit less like antagonistic. You're absolutely right. Like no is a complete sentence. I think, in human relationships, if it were that easy, then, we'd be throwing no out there all the time, and
It's
then
true.
things would just dissipate and it would be good. But I think that extra added communication, it adds in a little bit more understanding between people too. So you can kind of level, the playing field a little bit and say, hey, like, I appreciate when you do this for me. This actually makes me feel really overwhelmed, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
That's just an idea.
Yeah. Yeah. And those are amends to boundaries. Those are great, great amends and adding on to the boundaries. And there could be times where they keep kind of blowing past those, where maybe each time that happens, there maybe is an amend that is a little bit more and more direct, or there it kind of does have this, like, I think you had a great point that we can't always remove ourselves from different situations, especially if it's family or in a situation where we don't have freedom of movement around, or there's power dynamics. So at a workplace or something like that. So I think it's important to give ourselves lots of self-compassion too, that there are going to be instances and individuals whose ways of getting their needs met is by stepping over people's boundaries or kind of pushing things based on their own history, based on the way that they get their needs met. It has nothing to do with us. That makes it a little bit more challenging, and it may cause us to kind of have creative different kind of boundaries that aren't so clean cut as no or leave or time boundaries, but maybe 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 there are relationships where we hear, like, you've probably heard of low contact or no contact, or changing a relationship or ending a relationship might be more realistic. But then there's relationships, like Sarah was saying, that it's just a little bit more fluid, and
Yeah,
there's
or
creativity there.
there's a lot to be said for like the complexity of like a caregiving relationship, right? So if you
Yeah.
are a person living with a disability, I'm not saying everybody, but for many persons living with a disability, you may have a caregiver, right? And so
Mhm.
that person has that extra layer of like being very intimately involved in your life, and like there is almost like a bit of, a power differential there, and like a dynamic that can be really tricky. So it
Yeah.
may be that you can't, say like this person can't be a part of my life if there is a certain level of, physical dependency and,
Hmm.
getting your needs met. So that can be a situation that I think is something to talk through. And sometimes it helps to have like your trainer or another person to sort of like mitigate some of that stress too, so that as a client, you're not trying to take that on all by yourself. And getting an extra perspective from someone else, and maybe for that family member or caregiver to hear that can be helpful. I wonder maybe if Jen has encountered that like in any training situations with clients where there has been like that caregiver dynamic that really can be um, something to navigate when we're talking about boundaries.
I think yes, and both either the caregiver or a lot of times you end up in a similar situation when you're training a dog for a child.
Hmm.
That the parent is there and you're working the dynamics of the parent and the child, and how do you oftentimes, depending on the age or the maturity or what the child is capable of, you may be having the parent do a lot of the introduction work, initial training work, and then once it's a little more refined, you have the child learning how to use it. But there
Hmm.
may be cases where it's very clear the parent has a preconceived notion of what they want the dog to do, and that is not at all what the child wants or needs. Um, and so that can also get really tricky of trying to navigate that and helping the child set their boundaries, and helping the parent understand this isn't going to work for your child unless you allow them to do this kind of work, or if you step back, or stop giving conflicting information to the dog. That's when I see a lot of having to really delicately figure out how to say, okay, where is the parent or caregiver involved in the training? Where is the child or the individual involved? But it's really complicated with the power dynamics of a parent and child a lot of times.
Absolutely, absolutely. And how is that
Yeah,
different with, say, like an adolescent child versus like, a young
right.
child? And,
Yeah.
you've got,
Or
varying levels
siblings.
of, abilities. And I think that those can be times where the trainer really does have to step up in a different way. That takes maybe a skill set that we sort of have to hone as trainers. And that's another really good reason I think to have like as a trainer, to have a network of support and be able to talk to others who are trainers too, and kind of put your heads together. Like, how do you handle this type of situation? Like, how do you go in respectfully, but also like in a way that's going to clearly address maybe like some dynamics that are counterproductive, right?
Yep. And I think it's a lot of, always talking to your client, not to their parent, their caregiver, right? You're working with, who are you working with? And you
Mm-hmm.
may need to ask some questions of the caregiver or the parent, but preferentially working with who the actual client is, figuring out what they would say in their own words if they're able to,
Mm-hmm.
um, versus just deferring to what might be a much faster conversation, but versus just deferring to the helper, really taking the time to let that person express themselves, I think is really critical.
And I
And I
think
was,
that's so much more empowering, for
mhm,
someone who is having a dog trained, to help them, to be able to have a voice in that process rather just saying like, here's your service dog, like we're gonna go in and I'm gonna help mom, like help train your dog. Like I think that says so much. And sometimes we don't think about that, unfortunately, for kids when we really should, right? We really should help them to start to feel empowered when they're younger and like part of these
yeah.
conversations.
Yeah, no, I'm kind of looking at how that role changes. How does your role change around advocacy when, maybe this is for a child who at one age you're doing a lot of the speaking for them, but then when does your role change that you need to step back? And you set a different kind of boundary there of where are you involved, where aren't you, or a different, level of what interaction do I let them have so that they can learn how to set their own boundaries. One thing I was thinking back to the earlier question about handling cases where people aren't respecting boundaries is I was thinking in dog training all the time, we use the term, managing the environment. And, or if we want to be geeky, antecedent region. But there's ways that we can also do that to help when people aren't respecting boundaries. So for example, if someone's constantly in your personal space, maybe you sit down at a table and you have a conversation across the table. They can't get any closer to you then. Or if you're constantly having time issues, maybe you have an alarm that audibly goes off at a certain time, or, a planned phone call. I know I have definitely been guilty of, if I'm in the office and worried a meeting is going to go long, that I'll have someone come say, "Hey, Jen, I really need your help right now," to get out of something that's going to drag on and on. And so there's simple things we can do in our environment too that help us enforce those boundaries, with us out having to say them, as directly or verbally. It's like, hey, what can we set up that, that's why stand-up meetings are held as stand-up meetings, because you can only stand so long before you get tired. They don't encourage people to stay around for a long time.
Right.
So
I think it's a
that's
really
another thing to
trauma-informed
think about.
approach too. Like, it's a really trauma-informed thing to say. It's like adjusting it to your needs. And Sarah, you talked about having more of like compassionate instead of, I think it's easy sometimes to boil down boundaries into the no's or the I'm not doing this anymore, or like you're not my friend if you can't do this. But having it's accommodations and changes to your behavior, like having someone come in and say, "Hey, Jen, I really need your help." Or if you're struggling with verbal, I know for me, when I'm really overwhelmed, that's the first thing that like leaves is my ability to speak. So being able to in public hand up or shake head, and something that can be just, it's very trauma informed, because people who have trauma histories in particular, it can be very triggering. And not just trauma histories, but lots of different things can be very triggering to now be expected to all of a sudden be very direct with communication when maybe that hasn't been a way that has been safe before, or it's not safe with the relationships that they're building boundaries, which is why they need boundaries. Yeah.
I think those are really good thoughts. And, that there's something to be said for if you're feeling stuck and you're overwhelmed in that moment, can you get up and move? Like a lot of times with clients in my office, I'll share this example. They will want to keep talking. And I'll be like, okay, we're at our hour, and they'll keep talking. And so I'll get up and I'll walk to the door and I'll open it. And, I'll find a different way to transition out of that conversation. But it's okay to do those things. It's okay to preserve, your time and your energy. And sometimes it takes like a literal action. Like instead of just sitting and freezing and saying, "Oh, I don't know what to do in this moment," like move somehow. If you're in a session and, either the client or the handler feels like it's time to end and we're just not getting there. Okay, like let's get up and start moving together. And moving in that direction of like, okay, we're saying goodbye now. I think at some point you have to, when you're seeing the other person just can't seem to cut it off somehow, like you have to figure out like, how do I facilitate that through some action, because my words aren't hitting home, right? Just like Michelle said, sometimes we start to shut down because we're overwhelmed and we're like, my gosh, like I need to, move on for this. And maybe there isn't someone who can come and interrupt, or maybe we're using a timer, but it's not working. I've definitely had that before too. So sometimes just that literal like, hey, we're moving, we're moving on. So yeah. And if you're at a client's house, as a trainer, like sometimes you got to walk to the door and, decide like, this is the way that we're going to end today. So yeah.
And I think that's a really good point of like one way of setting boundaries, because I've had other trainers ask me this of how do you feel about training in your own home and having people come to your home? Because if someone comes to your home, you can't go out the door and leave, right? You have to get them to leave.
That's
I mean,
a
you
very
could go out the
good
door and
point.
leave, And
Mhm.
so I know a lot of people have really questioned and kind of worked with, do I want to have something in my home, or is there a very specific space that's segmented that maybe that's where
Mhm.
people come, or very specific hours, kind of the worries of will someone just show up? But that I think is a really important thing to think about, is if you have people coming to you, yeah, how does that movement work? It could be, like you said, I stand up and walk to the door to let them out of the office. But it can definitely be tricky, if they're sitting there and you're like, okay, time to go, and they're just sitting there.
Mhm.
Um,
And just
I'm
continue
gonna,
to
yeah.
talk is
And I know we're getting
something.
near the end of
Yeah.
time. One thing I know
Speaking
we're
of
going to talk about
boundaries.
in the third article on this, and maybe this becomes next month's topic, is really also about helping set boundaries for our dogs.
Mhm.
Um, and that's an area where I found, as people learn how to set some boundaries for their dogs, they actually start to learn how to set them for themselves. Because most of us are willing to advocate for somebody else more than for ourselves. And so that's another way I found to help people set boundaries, or even that I have, of like, okay, I'll, this is for my dog. Even if it's for me, I can say, oh, well, my dog needs this, right? For somebody that really struggles with social anxiety, needs out of a room, rather than having to say, I need to leave, say, oh, sorry, my dog just let me know they got to go to the bathroom.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think that's, as we look at setting boundaries for our dogs, we can also talk about also how can our dogs help us,
I use that sometimes too. My
you
dog
know.
has to go potty, and the kids will respond to that. They're like, "Oh, dog has to go potty. Okay." I think that's
So
going to be a really good segment. So I look forward to reading that. And yeah, I know Michelle's got some really good content in this blog. So
I did post in the chat the links to the two current blogs that are out, which you can always find on Atlas's blog site. We will be putting out another Instagram and Facebook post when the next blog comes out that links to those. Feel free to put comments or questions on those posts. Email us with topics you'd like to have. And we will be back here again at the last Monday of next month, talking more about kind of some other aspects of boundaries, and especially like helping set them for what does it look like to advocate for our dogs, as well. And how do dogs communicate their boundaries to us? And how do we read those and respect those? Michelle or Sarah, anything you want to end on?
I hope this has been really helpful for our
Yeah.
listeners. And, if you have any questions or you're feeling stumped, just know that you've got a
Mhm.
lot of support through Atlas, and we're here to help you out.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. And that it feels awkward at first to make a behavior change and place boundaries. That doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just takes practice and starting out really small. So small, less risky areas, places where you feel that you can really succeed, and then practice and grow that muscle. We also have resources at the end of each of the blog posts. They're all the same, but I think it's good to have repetition about the different types of boundary books, as well as the Atlas Assistance Dogs resource page.
Thank you all.